Hi students, this is Mr. Helper and this is the last video for biodiversity. Um, so the last step is trying to figure out what we're doing so far. This is not by any means an exhaustive list of things that we could be doing, but this is something that these are a few things that we're doing right now to conserve biodiversity. So if you're really interested in conserving biology and conserving biodiversity, you might be considered a conservation biologist, particularly if you're studying um, and trying to understand why it's going down and also how to protect it and how to restore, in general, biological diversity. Some things that you could be doing are collecting samples and checking for genetic diversity, drawing blood as you can see there from the birds, measuring the size of different animals, teaching others how to do so that we can increase our ability to measure by increasing the number of people that can do that. One of the great ways is by using the app like iNaturalist. Conservation biology is really wasn't around until we realized that we had a problem with biodiversity and ecosystem stability. And one of the specifics is looking at genes and understanding how genetic diversity is so important. And what we want to try to monitor is how similar different individuals are in a population. If they're too similar, we worry about something called inbreeding depression. This is happening when we have a small population size and that they're spread out and they're typically isolated. This makes them very vulnerable. So we have to, pay close attention to those populations. In 1973, we had the Endangered Species Act, and it was in large response to the DDT problem and Rachel Carson writing *The Silent Spring*. In 1973, we basically, the two major components of that act were to label organisms as either endangered or threatened. And since then, we've added different layers between those to help certain money go to that and response go to those organisms. Over the past few years, in between 1973 and now, we've had a range of changes to the Endangered Species Act. Some of them not always good. And as of 2016, there were 1,229 species listed as endangered and 367. I haven't updated that number, but I'm sure that it's increased, unfortunately. A classic success case for the EPA, and particularly the ESA, Endangered Species Act, is the bald eagle. In 1973, when it was first banned, DDT was really ravaging particularly top predators and keystone species like this. What happened was it was biomagnifying in these organisms at the top of the food chains. And as a result, populations of bald eagles were going way down, way down into the hundreds. And now we're coming back and we have well over 10,000 now in 2019. Those are the latest numbers. So spending, as I said, has changed over the time, and we've changed the ESA. Most recently, ESA has changed to reduce the number of classifications, so that there's a bigger gap between threatened and endangered, or vulnerable and threatened. There used to be like a near threatened classification, but it has since been removed, and a lot of conservation biologists have been really concerned about that because it makes it more difficult to identify organisms and then provide funding for protecting them. These ESA doesn't always stop development projects. So if you have particular landowners that draw up what are called habitat conservation plans. This will allow the landowner to own that property and protect it in a way that protects the habitat and also improves it. And also, there's a safe harbor agreement, which is a promise that the government will not pursue any additional um, action if the law owner or the landowner pursues actions that assists in the species recovery. Um, so what that means is that if you have done something to a species, but you've shown that you can help to assist that species in recovery, there's an agreement that says that in good faith you're going to be not prosecuted for that. Um, there's been a recent battle in the Northwest, in Oregon particularly. Um, Cattle ranchers and oil and gas drillers as well, um, trying to save the sage grouse, which is endangered. Um, and so, as a result of lack of funding, voluntary campaigns have started um, trying to protect them. In 1973, another thing that happened internationally was the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora, CITES, we just call it CITES. And what it basically bans is the international transport of body parts of rare organisms. This is the UN's sort of protection in terms of biodiversity. And the treaty called the Convention on Biological Diversity provides funding and incentives to make sure that not only do we ban it, but we try to support other businesses and government programs to help um, uh, fight and also support other ways of income for people rather than doing this illegal trade of body parts of rare species. An example of a success is the Serengeti National Park, where it was promoting sustainable crops like shade grown coffee and discouraging other ones like pesticides and farming. Another example of something that we've done is captive breeding, and a classic example is the panda in China. It's moved from one level to the next in terms of the red list in a good way, and we've helped to increase that population a lot. Um, and some organisms, because of the constant changes in the environment, loss of biodiversity, or loss of habitat, loss of biodiversity, loss of increased pollution, etc. There are some species, because they've been bred in captivity so long, that they no longer exist in the wild. They only exist in captivity. Again, another classic example of success is the California condor. It was a victim of hunting, and particularly lead shot poisoning. The lead was a heavy metal that was bioaccumulating again. And at one point, it was down to 22 individuals in 1982. So you can imagine the worry about inbreeding depression there. And in general, just finding enough mates in a particular area for these condors. And over a long period of time, couple of decades, we've now captively bred the California condor, and now it's up well over 500. And it's still a problem, but as of 2019, California finally banned lead shot. The cutting edge is taking DNA from endangered species and inserting into an egg of another organism that's a related species that lacks a particular nucleus for that species' DNA and implanting it into the female. The idea would be that theoretically it could uh, produce an offspring that is the originals and not the host egg's species offspring, genetically at least. Um, but there are a lot of obviously ethical questions about that, and hasn't quite been proven to be um, um, widespread in terms of the ability to do so. Dolly was the first one, the sheep. Forensic science is also important. It helps to protect species by analyzing and identifying um, organisms if they're illegally traded. Sometimes it's really hard to identify like bush meat, meat that's in the marketplaces um, that looks like other meat, but it could potentially be illegal. And so we have to test it genetically. Example, whale meat is being sold here in the picture to the left. Obviously, it's not advertised as whale meat, but if you have knowledge of that, um, you can test it and compare it to the DNA of actual whales. Last couple of things here, several strategies. One is to identify organisms as umbrella species and flagship species. We talked about invasive species and also ecosystem engineers. Um, and these are two other classifications we have. Umbrella species is a term that we use where we're protecting one organism, but when we protect that one organism, we're actually protecting a lot of other organisms. For example, the wildebeest, because they travel a huge range, we're not only protecting the wildebeest, we're protecting a lot of other organisms in that range that they migrate. And then flagship species, the classic example is the giant panda of the World Wildlife uh, Federation. And the WWF uses that as a symbol to help rally funding and government support for the protection of these animals. So there are certain animals, as you can probably guess, the elephant, the panda, the tiger. These are classic animals that are emblematic of conservation. Last few things here. Biodiversity hotspots. We have hotspots of biodiversity around the world. As you can see, there's a latitude gradient there. Most of the hotspots are located sort of in the middle equator area. And as it gets colder, obviously, we get less. Few exceptions to that. We have the bottom of Africa and parts of Peru in South America. But for the most part, we have certain organisms that are really mostly in the hotspots around the ecosystem, the equator. These are just a few extra points here. So there's still issues, right, around biodiversity, issues like logging and poaching and um, laws around extracting trees and such. Extraction of trees is a particular Connecticut problem. Protecting the oceans. This is a question of tragedy of the commons, right? How do we protect areas that are uh, not necessarily privately owned, but how do we protect them for the organisms that are living there still? In Kenya, efforts have really been shown to help with particularly educating the Maasai. They've been devastated by deforestation, and this is really called community-based conservation, where you engage local people to help. They were evicted from the Serengeti and forbidden for hunting wildlife, but they were also given authority over wildlife management. And this approach is really essential for preserving organisms, particularly when the human population is growing. And that's it.